Hey everyone, I'm super excited to be sitting down with Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist Gary Rivlin. He's been reporting on the personalities and power structures behind Silicon Valley for nearly 30 years. What's cool about Gary is he has the inside scoop on the who and what of the AI boom. I want to ask him about the technology risks and promises he sees on the horizon, as well as the players driving it, and if we can trust them. Let's find out. The first thing I wanted to ask you, I realize, is like a very loaded question for a technology podcast, but maybe I'll ask it anyway and see where it goes. Gary, I read that you have or used to have basically a plaque on your desk that your North Star is to state complex social issues in human terms impossible to ignore, which I love, by the way. But I wanted to ask you, as you kind of look from your vantage point in 2025, what are the complex issues of the day, or, the things that you think are worth crafting these narratives around that you want to be a part of, or at least want somebody, telling stories
Right.
of?
And by the way, it's still right there above my desk. A little bit faded. I should probably redo it. But my whole approach is to tell stories through the people. If we're talking about AI, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Why did it arrive when it did? That set of questions. What's it going to mean? The impact on society, jobs, etc. Rather than writing a book exploring each one of those issues chapter by chapter, I really kind of try to stay true to that motto, and just like, I think it would be dull for people, but if I can kind of introduce you to a set of characters who are almost emblematic, right? I mean, here's
Uh-huh.
someone trying to cash in on AI. Here's somebody who had the opposite view. By telling their stories, I think people could understand these complex social issues in a very relatable human way.
Right. So let's talk about that a little bit. And you've been, you know, the the questions of AI and the story of AI obviously is kind of intrinsically linked to Silicon Valley today. And you've been following the Silicon Valley beat, if I can call it that, for quite a long time. As you went back there and looked at some of these characters, what's changed in the past 20 some odd years there, and what's fundamentally the same?
Right. So, I started writing about tech in the mid 1990s. In fact, I'd moved from writing about politics to tech. I have an engineering background. I had programmed earlier in my life, and just boom, the dot com, the internet was with us. And so, some things don't change, right? Just like when Netscape went public, the internet was starting to spread. You saw a lot of excitement, a lot of over enthusiasm,
Uh-huh.
and so, kind of the hype, the overhype, the promise, the over promises, the internet was going to bring about world peace, essentially. Now AI is going to equalize between the developing world and the developed world. It's going to cure cancer. So
Yeah.
there's I think AI is an incredible technology. Obviously, the internet, has changed society in profound ways, but some of the overpromise almost feeds the other side's skepticism, and like, AI is not gonna, it might help some scientists help cure cancer, but AI isn't, not in quotes, going to cure cancer, at least anytime
Yeah.
soon. One big difference is the money. So when I first started writing about tech, I was always interested in the venture capitalists and the startups and that whole ecosystem. Like, this idea, like, our idea for a company is either going to be worth, back then, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, now billions, if not trillions, or it's going to be worth nothing. And the venture capitalists who are staking, back then millions, now tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions. But in 1995, venture capital was under $10 billion a year. By 2021, it was over 300 billion a year. Roughly 130, 150 billion went into AI startups last year. I mean, a lot of it went into a few, like
Yeah.
Anthropic, OpenAI, XAI. That's Elon Musk. They raised collectively tens of billions of dollars. Almost $100 billion just between those three. But there's still a lot more money going to AI startups. So the money has really changed. I guess the final difference is, when the internet came out, like, maybe the biggest criticism was around the attention span. Oh, there's if you're always online, this instant gratification. What was it going to do for consumerism in our society? Um, with AI, there was much more of a worry, much more of a backlash. People didn't, greet AI with open arms the way they did the
Mhm.
internet. People are fearful of it. We could talk about that. I think it's kind of Hollywood induced fear. I don't think the media has done such a great job with AI. So AI kind of has a double battle. Like there's the usual battle of creating a startup and trying to cash in, but the second battle of trying to convince people that this is a good thing and the laser-eyed robots aren't going to beat us into submission.
So let's talk about those laser-eyed robots for a minute. I'm curious, Gary, because you've painted, I think, pretty accurately the picture of how people talk about AI. Everything from this utopia of abundance, which, by the way, I get people who I talk to, I'd say routinely, who use words like that to
Mhm.
describe where AI is going to take us. Curing cancer, and laser robots who are going to destroy the world in the blink of an eye. Uh, you know from your vantage point, like, how transformational is this? Like, what's your outlook for what this technology can and cannot do in the next few years?
Right. So Reid Hoffman, who's the main character in my book, he has a set of terms. There's the doomers, the laser-eyed
Mhm,
robots. We're fearful of this thing. Let's bomb the data centers before they take over, to give the extreme of that.
mhm,
The zoomers, who say nothing. There should be no speed bumps, no regulation. The only role of government is to speed this thing up, in part because we're in a race with China, in part because tech is what's kept the U.S. Economy going and strong, and it's one of our competitive advantages as a country. I'm more of what Reid Hoffman calls a bloomer. I definitely am an optimist. I think AI is going to do extraordinary things around science, medicine, education, a whole wide range of things. But I do think we have to be deliberate about it, in part because AI is way ahead of the public. Pew did a poll last year, and the majority of Americans are fearful
mhm.
of AI. Less than a third are optimistic or excited about AI being here. And AI didn't have the best timing. I mean, innovation happens when innovation happens, but kind of hitting at the end of 2022, the distrust for big tech, the distrust for tech generally, was pretty much at an all-time high. And of course, AI, like, ultimately humans will lose their apex status as the smartest entity on Earth. But we're asking for a lot of trust. Like, if the big thing this year, of course, I'm sure you've been talking about this, is personal agents. Well, a personal
Right.
agent, they really have to get to know me. They have to know my private details. They're going to have a lot of agency in my life. And if these companies get ahead, this either the Googles and Microsofts of the world, or the startups that hope people are using their agents, they get too far ahead of people. I'm not sure people are going to trust these things. And one last point on that is, there is going to be something bad that happens because of AI. Just to make one up, like, $1 trillion is siphoned off from the global economic system before a human could even notice it. And
Mhm.
at that point, of course, we all know the way these things play out. People are going to be fearful, and so I'm a bloomer who thinks there should be some regulation, but I also think that AI is going to be central to our lives within a decade, maybe 15 years. Um, and it has vast potential.
Right. So with that in mind, and thinking about the trust part, we're in a space now where, well, let me ask it as a question. There's in your book, and I'm sure a little bit beyond your book, there's a handful of top dogs, I'll call them, who it seems like have a really outsized influence over this technology, how it's developed, how it's played out, how it collects data, what it does. Is that fair? Is there really kind of a small cabal that has an oversized amount of control? And do we trust them, and should we trust them?
Right. So you're getting at one of my fears around AI. It's nothing to do with laser-eyed robots or anything like
Hmm.
that. It's the consolidation in the hands of the same few tech companies that have been dominant for the last decade or two. It's funny. So I started this book right at the end of 2022, started 2023, and I went in search of the next Google, the next Meta. And I ended up concluding, like, I fear that the next Google is Google in AI and the next Meta is
Yeah.
Meta. That
Yeah.
big this stuff is really expensive. When I first started, people were talking about uh, millions, tens of millions to train, fine tune, and operate these chatbots, large language models, whatever you want to call them, and the same with text to video, audio to text to audio. Um, by the time I was done reporting at the end of 2024, mid 2024, it was hundreds of millions, if not billions. And Dario Mode from Anthropic, they do Claude, the chatbot Claude. He's estimating that they're going to need $100 billion by 2027 to train these things. And
Mhm.
so, who has that kind of money? Google, Microsoft, they have 100 billion or so laying around in cash. But if you have to raise $100 billion, or even if it's only, 3, 5, $10 billion, well, a large venture capital outfit in Silicon Valley has $1 billion all told in a fund. And so we're talking about billions. And so that's one way this is weighted to big tech. And the other is data. In fact, this is really central to the remedies. The government is now talking to remedies for the Google antitrust trial. A court, a federal judge, found that Google was a monopolist that abused its power. So now what should we do? And a lot of the discussion, I think rightfully, is around the data. OpenAI approached Google and said, "Hey, can we kind of buy access to your data?" And they said no. And that's a huge advantage. In fact, anyone reads the book, every time Google steps on stage in 2023, 2024, they fall flat on their face. Google was so far ahead of every other big tech company around machine learning. And, give them credit. They were using it in the 2000s and they went on a hiring binge. In the early 2010s, long before anyone else. They came up with the Transformer paper in 2017, the T and GPT. And so it's, foundational research. And yet, it's a big company that was scared. So OpenAI puts out ChatGPT. They try to catch up to a race they were already winning, but they're scared, so they weren't winning it. And they kept on falling on their face. Despite that, Gemini, their chatbot, is one of the 2 or 3 most popular chatbots on the planet because they're Google. We have many of us, Google's the front door to the internet. They have all this data and they can, train better and cheaper than others. So
Yeah, it's interesting, and your position is very similar to mine, I think, which is um, it really feels like there's, I don't know if I want to call it an arms race or a space race, but there's this race of some kind between these tech giants to try and just own the platform of the future, own the data, use it as a way to continue to monetize, the public here, I guess. So, with that in mind, who are going to be the winners and the losers of this shift to AI? And is it necessary? When you look out over it, do you really see it's winner take all with one or a few technology giants that probably are the OpenAIs, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Anthropics, or is it going to be more democratic than that?
yeah, I mean, we're talking about predicting the future, so take anything coming out of my mouth right now with a grain of salt. Um, I would kind of distinguish between OpenAI and Anthropic. They're relatively new startups. They have a lot of cash. They've raised
Sure.
billions, tens of billions of dollars in the case of OpenAI, versus a Google, Microsoft, Meta, Amazon, and Apple are they're not quite doing it yet, but
Uh,
they're in the race. To I want to be optimistic. I guess I'm built. I root for startups. I root for the underdog. To
yeah.
me, well, one thing that was exciting about AI is the possibility that there would be kind of a new set of major players. But I even wonder if an OpenAI, despite all its successes, right? It just raised $40 billion earlier this year. That's the largest raise in the history of venture capital. It's worth, it's got a paper worth of $300 billion right now, which if you put in the Fortune 500 would make it top 50. I think it's top 50 for the globe. And so,
Wow.
it's 10 years old, but it's seems on paper just kind of a global giant. It's been there around forever, but I'm still not sure they can make it because they're bringing in revenue, but they're still losing a ton of money. I mean, give them credit. They're making virtually nothing in 2022. In 2024, they brought in almost $4 billion. They'll have a much bigger number than that this year, 10 billion or more. But they're still losing money because this stuff is so expensive to operate. You can use ChatGPT or their other products for free. You can pay a premium, but you get a very good service for free. And so, it's like kind of that consumer thing. And you could just go to, Claude or U.com or Gemini or what it was, uh, Grok. You could use,
Rock,
Grok.
yeah.
That's Musk. And so, though that one costs. And so I do fear that what's going to happen is it's inevitable that one of the giants, Microsoft or Google, are going to buy an Anthropic or an OpenAI. Like, right now, Microsoft's put around 15 billion or so into OpenAI. Anthropic, their two biggest funders are Amazon and Google. And so let's take Dario Amodei at his word. In 2 years, where's he getting that $100 billion? I mean, I suppose he could raise that money, but I'm not even sure they're profitable at that point. So I do wonder if it's inevitable that these popular chatbots get bought by one of the tech giants.
Well, and I have to imagine the tech giants are chomping at the bit at the opportunity to buy, an OpenAI or an Anthropic too, and add them to their, to their stack.
Well, and they have been doing that, kind of this idea of an acqui-hire or Inflection, which happens to be the company at the center of my book. It was started by Reid Hoffman, this guy, Mustafa Suleiman, kind of a co-founder of DeepMind, which, is kind of the first great machine learning startup. It was started in 2010 in London, and Google bought it for $650 million. They had everything going for them. It's like Reid Hoffman, best connected guy, arguably, in Silicon Valley, kind of the pedigree of a Mustafa Suleiman, a great CEO. Bill Gates funded it. Will.i.am, kind of had that, kind of Hollywood thing. Ashton Kutcher was a investor. They hoarded all this talent. Some of the top researchers in the world raised $1.5 billion in like 15 months, but it wasn't enough. And so basically everyone at the company jumped to Microsoft. Microsoft paid the investors $650 million to make everyone happy. And, essentially this company, Inflection, really cutting edge chatbot. What I loved about it is it's great at EQ, emotional intelligence, not just IQ. But now the talent, virtually the whole company, is inside Microsoft. Google did the same thing with Character AI, spent billions of dollars essentially to hire the two creators of Character AI, really popular, another popular chatbot. These two founders, who are ex-Googleites, got frustrated at Google because they couldn't do what they wanted to do, went and did it in a startup, and then Google had to pay billions of dollars just to bring them back.
Yeah. So when I think about AI and the impact it's going to have, there's clearly this kind of, I don't know if I'm supposed to call it this, but I'll call it a boys club of like the big, incumbent or emerging organizations and the tens of billions of dollars and the kind of, political infighting you see there. And it's, it's funny, Gary, and I don't know if this is a result of your background or just kind of a parallel I picked up on, but I can certainly see through lines to what's going on here, to what you probably saw, covering City Hall, and those kind of political beats all those years ago, where it's jockeying for power and influence. Is that, I mean, is that fair? Is that just coming through, do you think, is there merit to that?
Yeah, there is. Like, in political sense, we call backroom deals kind of going on. That politics is happening in front of us, but the real deals are being cut behind closed doors. And it is true of Silicon Valley. It is true of tech. Like it's one of my big, criticisms. Let's just get five smart guys, and they are invariably guys, in a room, and we'll figure it out. And I mean, that works for your app. That has worked very well for tech. But I think AI is different. AI requires a much broader group of people. I mean, some of it is, what discipline are you from? Like, it's not just computer scientists, it's not just tech folks. AI, I mean, first off, it's linguists. You need linguists. It's math, and stuff. But I really want a much broader group, given the power and potential of AI and what AI is. I want a broader group in terms of discipline. I want a broader group in terms of who we're talking about. I mean, tech is heavily skewed male, of course, and these days it's very white and Asian. Our world is much broader than that. It's a global thing, and so bringing in people from different backgrounds from around the globe, to figure this out. I coming back to a point I made before about the strategy. I think it's going to be very dangerous for tech if this is the same old, where it's Sam Altman negotiating with Satya Nadella at Microsoft with a few other people in the room. I really think, for kind of trust and safety reasons, there needs to be a much broader group than the same old that Silicon Valley does.
It makes sense. And as I think about like what that impact could be and what this technology could do, I mean, we talked about why, the hype is kind of, inflated potentially on both sides. What impact do you see this having, I guess, across the population? And is this a leap forward in some ways for, the poor or the traditionally marginalized or underserved? Or do you foresee it just going to end up being like a rich get richer platform?
Yeah. So again, I'm about to predict the future. So take anything I say with a
That's what we
grain
do here, Gary.
with a grain of salt. But so I do think AI can be a great equalizer.
Hmm.
Kind of just, I give a couple examples. So in the sense of making art, if you want to make you're a movie maker, you want to make a movie, you need a lot of money to do that. You have to hire people and stuff. But with AI, you can make a movie. It's kind
Hmm.
of the great equalizer in terms of the art. It gives you these superpowers to do things. We could talk about the ramifications that all those actors and production people, etc., who aren't getting a job. And to add a caveat, it's not just like, make me a Martin Scorsese movie. The human is still the driver. The human has to bring the storylines and the plots and the plot twists and all that. And another example is, again, it could be an equalizer that anyone can code, right? I mean, I don't think we're quite at
Hmm.
that point yet, but we're not that far away for a point where you don't have to have a computer science degree. You don't have to have much experience of all, if any at all, and you could code, and that will really help. So someone in the developing world could see a problem that's not a first world problem, but a problem in their world, and do code, and have this magic power of coding to come up with a solution uh, tailored to their world. Just to use the example of education, I think AI has amazing potential for education. They did a study in Nigeria, where they had teachers use AI tutors. And of course, an AI tutor could figure out exactly what a student doesn't understand, and then feed them examples of information that helps them learn that aspect and stuff. And what they found is, just in a 6-week period, they had like 2 years of advancement in the students they worked with. And I really do think, this idea that, a tutor, $100 an hour, $200 an hour. I don't know what a tutor
Yeah.
costs, but it's a lot of money. It's beyond the means for most people on the planet. But what if this tutor was in your pocket, and it was, if not free, virtually free, or healthcare? There's a great stat that basically 1 billion or so people have access to ready healthcare, but there's 5 billion or so who have a smartphone. And should you go to a doctor, is a doctor better, or a nurse practitioner, or whatever, a healthcare professional better than a phone? Yes, 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 yes. But what about all those people who have zero access? And you
Hmm.
could take a picture. My child has this rash. Should I be worried and move heaven and earth to get to a hospital, or is it nothing? And so that could be a life and death thing. So I do think kind of this idea of a AI doctor in your pocket. It's certainly better than not having any access to healthcare. So that's another way I see education, medicine, that AI could be an equalizer. But the flip of that is that winner takes all, if not winner takes most.
Hmm.
And I am nervous that, as we've been talking, power over AI in the hands of just a few people will mean that that small group in Silicon Valley, or technology generally, is going to grow super wealthy, and only a little bit will spill over to the rest of us.
Yeah. It's Yeah, prediction there is a tough game, and there's like so many moving pieces to this. And I don't know if this is something you heard about or you're concerned about as well, but when I think about that, that AI doctor, which, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, I feel like that's already starting to happen, right?
Mm.
People are talking to
Right.
ChatGPT about their symptoms, and frankly, I think for the most part that's probably a good thing. But what I don't know if is happening right now, but I have to imagine we're on the cusp of, is ChatGPT or whatever, generative AI saying, oh, and you should take an Advil
Mm.
for your symptoms. And there's quietly, money changing hands between, the tech giant and Advil so that you take an Advil and not a Tylenol. And suddenly, you know, the difference to me between the web and some of these generative AI things is just, and even Google, frankly,
Mm.
is it gives you an answer that it acts like is definitive, right?
Yeah.
And what kind of influence does that have over people? Is that something that came up at all, or something that you have a perspective on?
Yeah, these chatbots speak with an authority. I joke, well, they were trained on a disproportionately male data set, and so they're know-it-alls. In fact, they've had to be teach to say, like, it's okay to say I don't know if you don't know. But what you're getting at is one of the things that, again, before we were talking about like what the fear out there is with laser-eyed robots. There are very real fears that are that we could see right now. And one of them is the power of AI to manipulate, or the power of AI to make suggestions that you think, well, this is just based on its knowledge, reading, what it's been trained on. And you don't know, like, oh no, the maker of Advil has paid for this. By the way, right now, I don't think there's any chatbots that are giving recommendations. I think people are using, and probably sometimes abusing, as if like people who do have access to medicine, like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm going to learn about this here, and like sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. There's stories where someone has struggled for months, years, to figure out what's wrong with them. They give it their symptoms to ChatGPT or whatever, and they figure out the solution. I mean, AI can be incredible. There's a study where they are training a chatbot to have early detection of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, just by hearing your voice. And so, that's the positive, where there's amazing things that can happen. They're really accurate at reading mammograms and, x-rays and all that, far more accurate than human doctors. I want doctors to use AI as a backup, as a check.
Mm.
I don't want AI reading my, another thing that worries me is autonomous AI. For the foreseeable future, if not forever, we need humans in the loop. These things, they know a lot about everything, but they don't understand a thing. They have no common sense. They have no, it's a parrot. It's repeating words, but it doesn't really understand. There's an expression I learned doing the research here, that it tends to know everything. These chatbots, these large language models, tend to know everything that humans over 20 years old know, but they don't know a lot that a kid under 5 years old, would know. Just kind of just the common sense stuff, like just stupid stuff like you chew this, but you don't chew this, you swallow, that kind of like they have
Ugh.
to be taught everything. And so, I do fear that we're going to invest too much power prematurely in these things. I really don't want autonomous AI anytime soon.
That's fair. What when you look at what we have or where we're going with AI, is there anything that came across to you as being underreported right now, either in capabilities or in risks that, you think we need to have a little bit more of a light on?
Yeah, so I mean, broadly speaking, I don't think the media. I mean, I used to work for the New York Times, so I am big media, I guess you can say, at least in my past. But that the New York Times, Washington Post of the world, I don't think they've done a great job covering AI, generative AI in particular, since the release of ChatGPT. That was November of 2022. There was a little bit about, its potential, but right away it's all the negatives. It's going to destroy education. It's going to write
Right.
essays for kids, and kids are going to use it for cheating. And that's a problem. But what about? In fact, I have an eighth grader, and he writes a composition and he gives it to ChatGPT, and it gives him feedback. The teacher's busy, but like, how can I improve this? Well, you can make a better topic sentence, and it's just repetitive kind of thing, and gets good feedback. And so it's an amazing tool for a teacher. You could devise lesson plans. You can use it to help with grading and all. And I think that has been largely missing from the coverage. Occasionally, you see an article about, oh, it could do
Mhm.
this around healthcare, and all. So I really don't think the broader public has a sense of what the true promise of this is. And the flip side of that is, I think people, in part because of the media coverage, are scared of the wrong things. I mentioned AI, autonomous AI, but AI, the use of AI in warfare, the use of AI for surveillance. A AI that can come up with a new vaccine or a new treatment or tailored treatments for this specific cancer or whatever someone is suffering through, can also create a deadly pathogen that could kill a lot of people. Kind of the potential for AI to write your wedding toast or for your friend's 50th birthday, is a powerful tool in the hands of scammers. And so I wish that's where the coverage was, around here are the potential pitfalls, and this is the stuff we need to navigate. I mean, every technology ever is both pro and
Mhm.
con. It cuts both ways. The car is extraordinary, changed our society, but a global warming, 35,000, 40,000 people in the U.S. die in car accidents. So every technology cuts both ways, and the same will be true with AI. And I think I wish we were being smarter, more deliberate about making sure AI was a net positive rather than a net negative. Right now, I don't know. Like, I'll give you an example of regulation. So the Biden administration impose, I thought, light regulation. Like, okay, if you're working on one of these powerful models, before you release it, we're going to require you to red team it, to hire an outside group to,
Mhm.
test for vulnerabilities and then share the results with the U.S. government. Didn't seem a very heavy lift, but as soon as Trump took over, he counteracted that executive order, and JD Vance in January, maybe February, was in Paris for the third of these worldwide AI summits. The first two were totally focused on trust and safety. This one was not. And there was JD Vance who stood up there and said, "Stop with the hand wringing. We need to win this race because of China, China, China thing." And that worries me. Government does have a role. Again, I don't want them micromanaging this. That's not the way we have great innovation. But I do think I do think we need guardrails, and I do think we need kind of this mindset. So we're really looking at the stuff around the corner that's negative and the stuff around the corner that's positive, so we can, you know, work it out so it's more positive than negative.
Right. So I'm thinking about that kind of doomer versus zoomer mentality, and it feels like, you know, as we look at the regulatory bodies broadly, we've gone from doomer to zoomer and just started like ripping off, red tape, if you can call it
Mm.
that. But it sounds like your perspective, Gary, is we do need the focus on some sort of responsible AI guardrails
Mhm.
are important, and that now is the right time to get some of that right. Is that fair?
Right. So it's funny. I was so if we had spoken in 2023, I would have been really optimistic about this. Right. I think most of us can agree that the government blew it as far as social media. Right. It was just like it took 20 years before their first hearing about social media, and by that time, social media had caused the problems. It caused. But AI, like remember Sam Altman in the spring of 2023, stood before the Senate and said, I have fears around this too. We need to be regulated. He was talking about a AI body, like, a nuclear regulatory agency like thing for AI. People have talked about a global version of that. And, the senators were talking about it. Chuck Schumer, then the majority leader, he had a series of talks in 2023 where they had leaders in AI come in and talk to the senators about here's the way it works, here's our fears, here's where we think the potential is. But then, you know, two things. One, the tech companies themselves, because of the arms race, as you called it before, they really dropped the trust and safety
Yeah.
aspect, or at least that took a back seat to winning this race, and kind of out our model will outdo your model. And the other thing, just kind of the wider politics, meant there really hasn't been much room lately for kind of debates about AI when we're talking about a whole different set of issues in politics. So now I am worried. Where I, I was at the school that I thought it was a good thing that OpenAI put out ChatGPT when they did. It wasn't that powerful yet. It really couldn't do much harm at that point. But it sparked a discussion, long before this thing was super powerful. Instead of we figured out how to make jet airplanes safe or relatively safe. There's very few accidents because it started off with prop planes, and we came up with rules, and then they got better and stronger. Cars, you know, we've anti-lock brakes, and kind of all those airbags, all those kind of safety things. It's good that we're kind of struggling with the technology before it's super powerful. But I think in 2023 we were really jumping on that opportunity. But now I don't hear it at all. It doesn't seem an
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah. No, it's fair. It feels like it has been almost like a pendulum swing in the complete opposite direction
And
there.
of course, pendulums never swing to the middle where they more or less should
Right.
be. They swing to the other
Right.
side. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's well said. Moving away from the government and the regulators here, if we think about the role that organizations play, and call it companies here, what what would be your best advice for, if you were brought into a boardroom of, a non, a non, whatever you want to call them, magnificent seven tech company, but just, a company that sits in the middle of the economy, is looking at AI, is looking at kind of future tech, wants to know if it can help them or hurt them, what they need to know. What's kind of your best advice for what they should be thinking about?
Yeah, so it's funny. My second interview ever as a tech reporter in mid 1990s with this guy Paul Sappho. He's a prognosticator, a futurist is kind of the more common word for it. And he said it wasn't his idea, but he's the one who shared it with me. We tend to overestimate the short term impact of a new technology and underestimate the long term aspect. And the internet was a perfect example of that. Like
Mhm.
all these startups thought we're going to get rich overnight, and every company had to embrace the internet or they were going to die. Well, most of those companies that thought they were going to get rich overnight went out of business, but slowly but surely the internet seeped into more or less everything. And so, probably took, I'm going to say 15 years before it was
Yeah.
central to everything. And I think the same thing is going to happen with AI. So back to the boardroom, I'd be saying this stuff is real. It's coming. Obviously, there are tools that individual employees can use, large language models, a marketing team, kind of its graphics ability and all. And you should be using that. In fact, I would encourage everyone in an organization to use it because our construct has been a little bit wrong. It's in the short and medium term, it's not going to be AI who replaces humans. There'll be some exceptions to that, but it's going to be humans who use AI who are going to best humans who don't. This is a powerful tool. I use it as an editor. I use it as a research assistant. I'm faster. I think I'm better because of it. So I'd be encouraging their individual employees. But as far as the organization changing its processes and stuff, I would encourage them to experiment, to be thinking about it, to maybe put a pilot project here, but it's not there yet. I mean, this is 2025 is supposed to be the year of the agents. And just like, well, first off, they don't have much of a memory. So if it's a personal agent that's going to be as if we're all wealthy people with a personal assistant that knows all our preferences and stuff, like it's having a hard time remembering us from session to session. So they're not a good personal assistant in that sense. And there's interesting things I see companies doing with these AI agents, but it's a work in progress. They're not quite there yet. So bottom line, like anticipate it, play with it, figure out how it might help. But right now, like there's also the exponential factor. Like these things have been getting like 10 times better more or less every year and stuff. So what we have today, we could presume that what we have in 10 years will be more powerful, different and stuff. And at the same time, there's this whole thrust ever since deep think, like, wait, maybe we're going to have smaller models and stuff. So, this stuff is moving so fast and there's still like big changes and all. I think a corporation's job, a business leader, or for that matter, an educator, anyone running a big organization is to be paying attention to stuff, find ways you can use it to help individual employees. But I'm not sure I would turn the company upside down yet.
And I like that, and it's it's clear advice. And if I can hone in on a part of it, going back to what you said about the startups and kind of the the web bubble that we had 25 years ago, it sounds like you've got a kind of a healthy skepticism of like companies that are thinking, oh well, I'm just going to uproot everything I'm doing and we're an AI company now. That's not the advice you're giving.
Right. So I'm going to contradict myself, but then I'm going to defend it. I think AI is underhyped and overhyped. And I think it's overhyped because these startups have taken hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, and they have to overhype it. They have to tell you that
Yeah.
artificial general intelligence is just around the corner to justify the huge amount of money they have. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, etc. They're putting Facebook, Meta, they're putting, tens of billions of dollars, into AI. So of course, they want to recoup their investment. So they're overhyping this like, hey,
Mhm.
use Copilot, it's going to change your life tomorrow, kind of thing. And so I think the individual companies, startups and big tech alike, the venture capitals who funded them, they're overhyping it. But I do think it's underhyped in that sense I said before, that we tend to underestimate the long-term impact. I think everything, business, education, healthcare, consumers and their personal relationships, I think everything is going to be profoundly impacted by AI. And again, I don't know if that's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, but at some point in the next decade or so, the world will look very different, the same way the world looked different after the internet, the same way the world looked different after mobile. I think we're going to see the same impact, if not a greater impact. I mean, there's this sense that, kind of the semiconductor plus personal computer, plus the internet, plus the cloud, plus the phone, all of that is undergirding, all of that is going to be used in AI. And so it's almost the culmination of, kind of the computer revolution or whatever you want to call it, since, over the last 50, 70 years. AI is the culmination. In fact, AI had been, and Bill Gates has a fun quote about this, that, that's been the holy grail for him since he first touched a computer, right? Like, again, the power of Hollywood, that power of science fiction and media, this idea that, like Star Trek, we could talk to the computer. For me, it was like, what was it called? Lost in Space, that we'd all
Mm.
have a robot helper who had all the information in the world, that was super powerful and could protect us. And I do think that's been the dream. And I do think, like, we're getting pretty close to that dream.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's well said, and it is, it makes me reflect on the fact that this is the continuation or the extension of a thread that's been running for a long time, right? People say AI, and sometimes we talk about AI abstractly in a way where it's like, okay, what are you actually talking
Right.
about when you say AI? Because, beyond like the narrow scope of Gen AI, and maybe even with it, AI, it's an algorithm,
Mhm.
right? Like it's taking input, transforming it into output, and in some way, creating something new or doing something new. And it's like, well, that's what we've been doing all along, right? Like that's what computers were meant to do. We've just gotten to a point at it now where like something has tipped over, and what it's capable of doing, and whether it's agentic or whether it's generative, but it's still the same thread.
You asked me for surprises. Another surprise is AI has been with us for a long, long, long time. And the term artificial intelligence was first coined in the 1950s. And, there have been people who thought, like, AI, useful AI is just around the corner. It's been a decade away for like 70 years, and we're finally around that corner. We're now finally where, people can use it. But the truth is, Google's been using AI in search, to help translate a garbled search, spelling mistakes and such. They've been using AI since the 2000s to more efficiently deliver up ads. In the 2010s, I'll stick with Google Translate. That's AI. And,
Mhm.
that's, I think 2015 is when Google Translate came out. So, billions of people have been using AI without knowing they're using AI. Suggestion engines. You go to Netflix, you get a recommendation of movies you might like. That's AI. So we've been using AI for a long time. I think the difference with generative AI, the difference with ChatGPT, is we could talk to it. It wasn't this thing behind the scenes that you had to kind of know how it works to know that was artificial intelligence. Now you could speak with it, and it's funny. I kind of was a skeptic in the second half of the 90s, where, okay, this stuff is really interesting. I was, I used email. I love, browsing things on the internet, but, you know, these dot coms seem kind of preposterous to me, and some of the claims that are being made. So, the end of 2022, I started using ChatGPT. I'm a I'm a journalist. I was, a reporter who covered this stuff. I'm used to tech companies overstating the potential of something, but first off, OpenAI, there was no press release, there was no press event. They
Mhm.
just released this thing on November 30th, 2022, with a research report. And, kind of word spread, rather quickly and stuff. But, the first time I used this, like, I was ready to be unimpressed. And, it was magical. It was cool. It was fun. It was like extraordinary. Like, first thing I did, like, write me a 5,000 word book proposal justifying a book about AI. This is the end of 2022 and stuff. And, two things: it's far better read than I am, has a far better memory that I do. But the other thing, it was flat. I mean, I couldn't like hit print and turn it
Yeah.
in, kind of thing. But it was like it took like what ended up taking me a week. It produced a serviceable proposal within a minute. And,
Yeah.
it's just like its ability to write poems. One of my favorite early uses was, and this kind of underscores that it's original, it's generative AI, it's creating something original. explain Marx's economic theory in the form of a Taylor Swift song, and it was really good. It was really clever at doing it. And obviously, that was original. I don't think they went out and found that somebody had done
Yeah.
this before and produced it. So I kind of did start with the this stuff being magical. I could be talking to you right now. I don't understand Italian, but we could translate my words with my voice, and I could do this interview in Italian or Chinese or just any of a dozen, 2 dozen languages. Probably by this point, 100 plus languages. And so I do think it's an extraordinary technology. That was kind of fun for me because again, as a journalist, you kind of have ideas in your head. I think as a good journalist, you should be willing to say, oh, what I had in my head was wrong, and not just like pursue examples that show like, oh, this
Mhm.
thing is, lousy. So it was fun for me to like kind of have my world turned upside down from the start as I was going out and introducing myself to founders, venture capitalists, those trying to cash in on this AI moment.
Yeah. No, it's super, super neat. And yeah, it's fair. I think it came as a surprise to all of us. I do, Gary, want to slightly switch gears and talk about back to the human in the loop and 2025. And maybe we can talk about AI or maybe not. But what I wanted to ask you about is I think about 6 years ago, you wrote a book series called Masters of Work
Right.
on a few different, what you considered really interesting, important roles at the time. You did venture capitalists, you did cybersecurity, you did sports agent.
Right.
If you were to do that again in 2025 or 2026, has that changed for you? Are there new roles that you've found in kind of your research and what you've been pressing up against that you think are going to be really, really interesting in the next few years?
So that was part of a bigger series, and those are the three I chose. There were like 20 or so professions. I'll answer it differently. Like, I think something that's so interesting is, what's going to be the impact of AI on jobs? Already we're seeing AI being very productive in customer service centers. This idea that the AI could do a perfectly good job of answering basic questions. I need to reset my password kind of thing. So there's millions of people who work in customer service. It's going to take a big chunk out of that. One of the more There's 8 to 10 million people who make a living in this country as drivers, long haul drivers, Uber drivers, taxi drivers, local delivery. How far away is autonomous vehicles? I mean, I was just out in San Francisco, and there's robo taxis everywhere, and it's working. They're in a few different cities, so I can't predict if we're 2, 5, 10 years out, but at some point in the foreseeable future, all those jobs as drivers, or most of those jobs, you still need delivery people that carry it, unless we have a robot in the car, bringing in the stuff they're delivering. And so, there'll be job categories that are decimated by
Yeah.
AI, but there'll be these new categories that we can't understand. And one of the obvious ones right now is prompt engineer. It's not as you have to something I think people who don't use AI don't understand is that you're still the creative. You're still the one who's needs to find the use in this thing. You just can't like tell me something interesting.
Yeah.
When I use it, I use my knowledge, and I've done a little bit of research, and I can guide it and stuff. And so prompt engineer is going to be, or is, a job, but there's all these job categories that we can't imagine. The example I use, it's, Gutenberg comes up with the printing press, and, we could worry about like, oh, what are all these monks going to do? How are they going to earn a living kind of thing? But it gave rise to the publishing industry. It gave rise to newspapers and magazines. Like there's millions of people, who have jobs based on essentially this technology, the printing press. And so I can't help but think that AI is going to create job categories that our brains can't quite understand, because we need to see how it plays out. I do fear that AI is going to be is going to lead to the destruction of more jobs than the creation of new jobs. But I could be wrong. I think I said the same thing in the mid 1990s. and the internet, right? I mean, you need less people at the Amazon bookstore than you would at the local bookstore. So in my head, like, oh my goodness, the internet is going to destroy all these jobs. But we have 4% unemployment right now, so somehow we figured that out. But I am scared of that, and it actually happens to be something I'm writing about and researching now because I don't know the answer in my head. Again, I fear it's going
Mm.
to be largely a big net negative, but I've had that fear before and have been wrong.
Well, so can you tell me a little bit more about that? What your next project and what you're looking into?
I mean, this is just an article I'm working on for the New York Times. Um, but if you look at my career, I've written about tech, or I've written about politics, urban issues, and of course, what's been happening the last year or so is you know tech has eaten politics. Tech is at the center of politics. I would argue that tech is the largest special interest, corporate interest, whatever you want to call it, like in the history of politics. Like in the old days, you know, uh, uh, the rich moguls would write big checks, and kind of have their politicians they treated as puppets. But this is different. I mean, first off, look at Elon Musk, 250 million or so. Crypto put like $200 million into the 2024 election. They're writing much, 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 much bigger checks. And so somehow I wonder if there's a book there, The Billionaire Boys Club.
I did, Gary, want to talk to you about something else outside of tech and politics that you kind of touched on earlier, both in your career and with like the Gutenberg Press example, which is journalism and how journalism fits into all this and what AI means for journalism. Journalism, I mean, I don't think I'm being controversial by saying it's in a pretty precarious place right now, and has seen, uh, in my eyes, like a rapid and depressing, you know, decline in the past decade or more. What does all of this mean for journalism? And if you had like, well, let me maybe just leave it there.
Yeah, so this has been going on long before AI grew front and center. In fact, you can make the argument that it was the internet. The
Mhm.
internet, Craigslist wiped away classified advertising. That was a big piece of the revenue for any newspaper. A whole set of things. AI, I fear, accelerates that. I mean, again, I think AI could be a good tool for journalists to help him or her do her job. But I do fear, in fact, we're already seeing it, that AI is good enough right now where it could write a basic news story. Kind of the one of the coins of the realm these days is like the hot take. Well, AI could just digest what's being said about, this event or that, and you train it, it could come up with a hot take much faster and many, 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 many
Mhm.
more than any human. Sports Illustrated, they got in trouble for it, but they created these bots, even gave them names and backstories, as if they were real humans. They were deceptive about it, but they were using them to write stories. CNET, the same thing. They did it, but they stopped because they found that their half the stories or more had errors. Some of them serious errors. So again, I come back to this idea like, okay, we could use AI bots. I think it's dangerous to create a rough draft of a story, but there has to be humans in the loop who are skeptical, who are like, wait, what's the source for that? So when I use, a chat bot to do research, I use one of them like Perplexity as an example that footnotes, because I'm not going to trust anything it says. I mean, most of what it
Mhm.
says is right, but most of what it says is right is not good enough.
Yeah.
And so I always want to go, oh, okay, that quote, here's a CNBC article that had that quote in it. And so, it can be a tool, but, I'm scared that, with all the pressure on um, news outlets to cut costs, because we're getting,
Yeah.
they're getting less revenue from subscriptions, less revenue from classified ads, less revenue for advertising. Um, that their solution is going to be, kind of reporter bots and all. But, who's going to go to the meeting, the city council meeting, and get the quotes? I mean, I still have to think there needs to be journalists out there doing this shoe leather reporting and all. But, big companies, they're always looking for ways to save money. Maybe we'll have reporters, but the editors and copy editors, they'll be bots. So I think there'll be a
Yeah.
profound impact of AI. In fact, one more data point, and again, this isn't AI. This is before AI. You know, newspapers and magazines in the U.S. brought in like $50 billion in advertising collectively in 2000. But Google and Facebook, now Meta, they have eaten huge portions of that to the point where it's now closer to 10 billion rather than 50 billion. That's a lot of money that they're no longer getting. And so how do you make it work? How do you, as a newspaper, magazine, a publication, make it work? AI is a way you can save money.
Right. And it makes sense. And I really like, your take on it and what you covered. There's one like specific piece that I want to dig in a little bit deeper, which is specifically investigative journalism, which is something that you've focused on in your career. And to me is, I don't know, maybe the piece that's least replicable by AI, either because they can't do it or because, the news outlets of the future don't necessarily want them to do it.
Right.
Is that like, what is the future of investigative journalism, and is it in trouble in your eyes?
Well, investigative journalism is in trouble generally because it's very expensive, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I could write 2 news stories a day if I'm just going to a city council meeting, or I get a press release, make a couple of calls, and crank it out. I've spent months on investigative pieces. So investigative reporting is expensive. Generally, there's been kind of a nonprofit model where like, ProPublica, will have an outlet that does investigative journalists. That's their thing, and they're funded by foundations and such, and users who appreciate their work. So I don't think that's reversing anytime soon. In fact, I fear that it's going to be less and less what media outlets are able to invest in. But to kind of express an optimistic note for a moment, like, AI could be an amazing tool. But one thing that AI is so good at is going through vast sets of data and finding connections that no human, could see. And so, the SEC, there's a gazillion filings from publicly traded companies. Could train AI to look for patterns, like, look for times where there was big news announced by a company who sold stock inside the company ahead of that, just to use a quick example off the top of my head. But so, AI could be an extraordinary tool, again, as long as there's a writer or a set of writers who are using that tool, because it's the human instinct that's going to understand like where the story is. These things that, we're at GPT 4.5, right now. So I don't know what GPT 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 is going to be like, but these things cannot write a good investigative story. These things could not write a good magazine story. These things can't write a book, and they seem a long, long, long way. They're too flat. They're boring. They're, as you pointed out before, they're just mathematical models looking for patterns.
Right.
And so it's derivative by definition. What makes a book good is it's original. I would argue that the human toil and sweat is what makes it good. It's the sense, the approach of the writer. But I don't know. I mean, I do wonder if these things are getting 10 times better, more or less, every year. Will there ever be a point where it could write a beautiful novel? Will it ever get a point where it could like write a really engaging, page-turning work of nonfiction that's told through characters, like replacing me? I don't, I joke that I'm writing as fast as I can because I don't know if that's going to happen, but I definitely think it's possible it's going to happen.
Yeah.
What do you think?
No, it's.
What do you think of that?
I mean, first of all, I was going to say I really appreciate the note of optimism there about what it can do, and as I was just as the wheels were turning as you were talking, I don't know. I think it wouldn't shock me if at some point AI could get to writing articles, if not books, maybe books. The things you've probably seen this too in your research. One of the limitations right now is that the longer you let generative AI generate, the more likely it is to go off the rails and
Right.
go in some wacky
Yeah.
direction. And the analogy, by the way, that I kind of thought of for this is like, I feel like that's true of like the human body, right?
Yeah.
Like once a human, turns 100, like things start going wrong with the body because it's
Yeah.
been running for too long and all
Right.
those little things start to add up. Generative AI, I guess, is the same way. Um, so long form, I think, is probably safe for a little bit.
Right.
But I've certainly found in experimenting with it, Gary, that you can ask it like, be compelling. And in a short way, it can be more compelling and less flat. But the piece that is interesting and gives me hope there is more on the investigative journalism piece and the tool for it to be able to make those connections. And you said it, but it's really only as good as the prompter is,
Right.
right? Like it needs a human to ask the good questions
Mhm.
and give you the answer to that good question. And I mean, I
And
can tell you anecdotally.
it needs a human to digest it. I mean,
That's right.
it'll give you a vast amount of data, like, and it's your job as the writer, the journalist, the human,
Yeah.
to kind of figure out like, oh, here's my story. Again, I'm always playing with it. I'm always like,
Yeah.
here's my notes. Give me a good opening. I'm like basically
Yeah.
for every time doing that. But it's like, oh, but that's an interesting word to use. And oh, that's
Right.
a good place to start. I hadn't really thought of that.
Yeah.
So again, it's
Yeah.
this, Microsoft calls their chatbot Copilot.
Mhm.
And I think that's the perfect, what I like about that is that the name tells you what it is. You're
Yeah.
flying the plane. You're the
Mhm.
one who knows this, but you got this really good assistant right there that could do some work. I have to go to the bathroom, so okay, you fly for a minute, but just for a little bit. I'm landing this thing. I'm taking
Yeah.
it off. Uh, um, and so it is your co-pilot. And again, whether we're talking about investigative journalists or more or less any creative professional job, it really is this amazing tool. Like reports, like it could write a
Mhm.
really good, efficient 20-page report that reflects more or less every 20-page report that's written on a white paper like thing on a
Mhm.
basic subject. So if I was in that, if that's the kind of writer I was, two things. One, I'd be using it. Again, you're steering it. You're the prompt
Mhm.
engineer. You're the one who is going to have to figure out how this is useful. You need to edit it. You need to rewrite it and digest it. But instead of it taking 2 weeks to write that report, maybe you could do it in 3 or 4 days. But the other thing I'd be thinking is like, I might want to find a different career, because if my big company has 20 of us who writes reports, it's not too hard to imagine in the not so distant future that instead of 20, they might have 2 or 4 of us.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's well said. But I do love the I just wanted to kind of close that out with the notion that to me, and I don't think you'll find this controversial at all. Like journalism and especially investigative journalism are a public good, right?
Mm.
Like they do something of benefit to society, and I worry about a future where they're not there. And you've given me hope that whether it's that or some of the other kind of creative tools for it, they're not going away, and it can actually be a force for good as we look at what it can do.
Yeah, I hope so. But there is that other trend line that we don't have enough investigative journalists. There's, you know, most local newspapers, have few, if any, investigative journalists. But investigative journalists have uncovered extraordinary thing.
Yeah.
Watergate, Jeffrey Epstein, kind of the list is long. And I think
Hmm.
at this moment, getting back to a point you made before, like, Elon Musk could say what he wants to say and stuff, but investigative journalists are the ones who figure out, and the New York Times has done a great job of this, saying like, wait, but there's all these investigations that the federal government and say, how does that work out? Like, wait, you get contracts. In fact, with rural broadband, like
Hmm.
there's, I don't know where it is. It's not my topic, but there's talk of Starlink. That's a Musk product. Of Starlink being brought in to give us rural broadband, bring broadband to rural areas. Well, not broadband, bringing us wireless, bringing
Yeah.
Starlink instead. And like that could be worth billions and billions of dollars to Musk.
Yeah.
So, is that what's happening? I don't know, but I think it's an investigative journalist's role to unearth that and say, like, okay, I don't mean to be a cynic here, but there is this other set of motivations
Mhm.
that the public should know about when they listen to what Elon Musk says about X or Y.
Well, and if the biggest barrier to that right now is, well, it's cost prohibitive to have too many investigative journalists for a local paper or for any paper, and we say, well, wait, AI can decrease the cost of an investigative journalism piece by 10x.
Mhm.
Suddenly, you know, in my utopian world, that's back on the table, and that could be really interesting.
Yeah, 10x might be a little bit too utopian for my taste,
Fair enough.
but
Fair enough. A
I
guy
mean, I
can
guess.
dream.
um, but I keep on coming back to this term. I stole it from Reid Hoffman. Kind of superpower that it does amplify your intelligence. It does amplify your ability to do things, and I'll just kind of restate something I said earlier. Like, investigative journalists using AI are
Mhm.
more powerful than investigative journalists who don't use AI. So I do think this could kind of, if not an equalizer, I do think it could help. What's a he- help preserve what's a diminishing resource in our country.
Well said. Gary, I wanted to say a big thank you for today. This has been really, really fascinating. A lot of really interesting insights I'll be taking away. So really appreciate you coming on and the time you spent here today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. This was fun.